Good evening, everyone. If you're just joining us for the Book Club of California program for Monday, September 26th, well, you're in the right place. We're going to be getting started in just a moment or so, but you can see on your screen that the title of our talk this evening is We Are Not Animals, Indigenous Politics of Survival, Rebellion, and Reconstitution in 19th Century California. And our speaker is Martin Rizzo-Martinez. We're going to be getting started in just a moment, but sit back, relax, and be patient, and we'll let folks in from the waiting room and then begin. Thanks. All right, if you've just joined us, it's just a minute or two past the top of the hour. We're going to give it another few seconds or so here to let people join us from the waiting room. But if you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, September 26th, again, you're in the right place. We're going to be starting in just a moment or two, so sit back and relax. Thanks. See a few more people have joined us. We have quite a number of folks registered for this presentation, and we are going to get started, and they can join us in progress. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online program titled We Are Not Animals, Indigenous Politics of Survival, Rebellion, and Reconstitution in 19th Century California. This is a live online presentation by author and historian Martin Rizzo-Martinez. Now, my name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight and host this webinar. As I said, we have a lot of people registered for this event. We have more than 170 people who've registered for this presentation. So for those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a particular focus on the literature and history of California and the West. Now, the book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a book club member, or if your membership has lapsed, and you're really interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or to donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. Again, the program's titled We Are Not Animals, Indigenous Politics of Survival, Rebellion, and Reconstitution in 19th Century California. It's a live online presentation by author and historian Martin Rizzo-Martinez. Now, Martin Rizzo-Martinez received his PhD in history from UC Santa Cruz. He now works for the California State Parks as the historian and the tribal liaison for the Santa Cruz district. In addition to working on a second book, Martin is also a co-producer of a podcast entitled Challenging Colonialism, and is producing a documentary film entitled Walk for the Ancestors, about a Native family that walked from mission to mission in 2015 to honor their ancestors and protest the canonization of Junipero Serra. So his book, We Are Not Animals, Indigenous Politics of Survival, Rebellion, and Reconstitution in 19th Century California, was published in early 2022. Now, by examining historical records and drawing on oral histories and the work of anthropologists, archaeologists, ecologists, and psychologists, We Are Not Animals sets out to answer questions regarding who the indigenous people in the Santa Cruz region were and how they survived through the 19th century. Between 1770 and 1900, the linguistically and culturally diverse Ohlone and Yokuts tribe adapted to and expressed themselves politically and culturally through three distinct colonial encounters with Spain, Mexico, and the United States. In the book, We Are Not Animals, our speaker traces tribal, familial, and kinship networks through the mission's chancery registry records to reveal stories of individuals and families, and shows how ethnic and tribal differences and politics shaped strategies of survival within the diverse population that came to live in Mission Santa Cruz. Now, if you have any questions for our presenter or comments, you can use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. We should have time at the top of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the chat and the Q&A. So now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Martin Rizzo-Martinez, and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Martin, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I really appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to present here for the Book Club of California. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you tonight from my home in Santa Cruz, which is the ancestral homelands of the Uypi people near the village site of Alintak. These lands today are stewarded by the Amamutsan tribal band, who are the closest ancestral neighbors to the Awaswa-speaking Uypi people who lived here. I want to start by clarifying that my work as a historian is no substitute for listening to Indigenous peoples today who are able to speak from the lived experiences about the history, which I will share some in my book. So it is my hope that my work will help direct people to listen to learn from, and to work in collaboration with contemporary Indigenous communities. My book helps illuminate important historical context in early colonial California, and can help us better understand and appreciate the strength, resiliency, and ingenuity of Indigenous Californians historically and today. Now, like many of us, or probably most of us here today, I too am living on lands that are not those of my ancestors, which is why I feel it is about this history and to support those same Indigenous communities on whose lands we get to benefit by living here today. My own interests and questions that drive my research, the questions I ask, really come from my own family's long history in colonial New Mexico. Now, before I get into some of the stories I'm going to share from my book, along those lines, like I was just mentioning, I just want to point out a couple other books that are very important out there. For those who might be interested in the histories that I talk about in the Santa Cruz area, I think it's really important to check out the book, what's on my left here, Bad Indians by Deborah Miranda. And Miranda is a member of the Ohlone, Kosnoa, and Esselen Nation, which is based out of Monterey, not too far from where I am today. And in her book, Bad Indians, is a tribal and family memoir. So again, like I was saying, I think when you're able to actually hear firsthand from people who have lived experience of this history, I think that it's really crucial that we listen to those. There's other great works out here too. I just highlighted a couple in this image, but if you haven't read, I want to encourage people to check out Greg Sarris's new book, Becoming Story, as well as my friend and colleague Sim Schneider in his book, The Archaeology of Refuge and Recourse, which is an amazing study of how the Coast Miwok state continued to kind of exist outside of the missions. Really important stuff. Okay, so before we get into the stories from my book, I want to give a little bit of context to talk about. My book details the history of Indigenous people of the greater Santa Cruz region from before the arrival of Spanish colonists up through about 1900. One of the themes that my book focuses on is that Indigenous peoples of the greater San Francisco Bay Area were interconnected through long-standing ties and interrelationships. By the time the Spanish arrived in California in 1769, they encountered a highly sophisticated and complex indigenous society. While the Spanish failed to recognize this complexity, it is important to recognize that this complex society was interconnected through a diversity of economic, social, political, and spiritual ties throughout the greater region and throughout California. And this complexity did not disappear through the disruption and violence of the Spanish colonial era and the ensuing eras after that, even with the introduction of the missions. A lot of studies tend to assume that those ties ended at that point. But my work focuses on how indigenous resistance and ways in which Native people challenged and fought back against colonial control. And the stories that I'll share today will demonstrate how strategies and tactics of resistance transcended geographies and tribal lines. Now, my approach to doing this work has been to center on oral histories whenever possible, but this includes oral histories recorded from the late 1800s, ethnographic interviews that took place in the early 1900s, as well. I also worked closely with local tribal members today. In particular, I worked with a couple members of the Amamutsan tribal band, including tribal chair Valentin Lopez, as well as, and probably most crucially, Amamutsan tribal historian Ed Ketchum. And those who read the book will see I quote Ketchum quite a bit and include a lot of the stories that he shared with me. What I found, this also includes working closely with the archival documents such as the mission chancery records. And this is the baptismal and burial marriage records at the missions. And while these records were written with Spanish hands, I argued that they constitute an indigenous archive themselves. The information was written into the books, but it was informed by Native people who told them what to write in there. And there's all sorts of little information that we can find there. And what I found by doing this research is that even in the colonial archives, it is possible to find the voices of and the perspectives of indigenous peoples when reading against the grain. And I'm going to share some of these stories and some of my methodologies with you tonight. This map, by the way, in the background is kind of a map of the larger indigenous region of the Monterey Bay, including with village sites in different tribes throughout there. This map here that I'm showing you is a map that was designed, I helped design it, but it was made at the request of the Amamutsan tribal chair, Valentin Lopez. And he suggested he wanted to see if we could make a map that would show the specific tribes and communities that were taken eventually to Mission Santa Cruz. And I think it really is an important one because it helps to show how wide-ranging the impact of the missions were. A lot of times people think that the missions just impacted the Native communities right in that area. Santa Cruz is kind of the northern part of this bay. And I'll just point out, these were the tribes that were made up the majority of people eventually that were taken to the mission. But the first range of tribes kind of going out to the Chiloctaca and the Aptos, there were all spoke the language of the Owaswas, Ohlone language. The people on the other side of the hill, or really the Matalan, Unahima, Alsaima, those people were also Ohlone, but they spoke the Mutsun language. And then once you go past the Locobo on this map here, and those tribes out there, we're in the San Joaquin Valley. And those were the tribes who are known as the Yokuts. And I think this is important. I might reference some of these names later in this, but I also want to point out the diversity of different tribes, the different languages that were spoken in the missions, the different communities, different families. There was a wide range of people who were kind of thrust into these mission situations and trying to make sense out of this. So in order to understand the communities that were impacted at Mission Santa Cruz or any of the missions, and maps like these could be made for any of the missions really in California, but it's essential to center beyond the missions and to really consider tribal kinship and other indigenous networks and connections and how those networks extended far beyond the missions themselves. One of these, in many cases, tribes and even families were divided and sent to different missions. And this was often done as a way of subverting power from some of the more powerful tribes in the area or families that had a lot of influence. But these kinship ties that transcended the mission boundaries continued through the mission years and beyond. And researchers are now recognizing the ways in which people communicated across geographic space and they continued with trade of traditional goods and resources, or exchanged ideas and other strategies across those lines. And I'll give you again some examples of these when I get into the specific stories. There's a couple other points, quick points of context that I want to give, is I think it's really important to understand before we talk about some of the stories within these spaces. It's important to understand that the missions themselves were devastating spaces of great loss and trauma. This is a chart I did when I was helping out. I mentioned that Kevin mentioned a family that I'm helping to document their stories they went through, but they asked me to look up the baptismal and burial records at each of the missions, which is what I have put together in this chart here. And this is information that's out there in the public, although I kind of traced through to kind of make sure I could, correct these numbers. But what I want to show you and emphasize here is that I highlighted Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista, which are the missions where the Amamutsan tribal band that I work closest with descends from. And what you can see here is that the number of the column on the left is the baptisms, and the column on the right is the burials, right? And this traces through the beginning of the missions up to the closing. I think that I stopped at 1835 here, which is kind of around when the missions were secularizing and people were being emancipated from it. But the takeaway, and I think the crucial point here that I'm trying to make, is that over 90% of the people baptized at Mission Santa Cruz had died by the time the mission closed, in a span of just under 50 years, and a little less time at San Juan Bautista, but the numbers were equally very difficult, right? Over 85% of the people coming in there. And even when you take into account people who might have died of natural causes over that time period, had the missions not been there, those numbers are devastating. When you look at the 35 or so different tribes that came into Mission Santa Cruz, for example, you have to understand that this is a space where people were losing kinship members, they were losing family members, wives, children, at an alarming rate that was regular. In fact, the population relative stability of the numbers, if you looked at each mission over across the years, is only because as people are dying, new groups were being brought into the missions, which gives it this sense of somewhat stability. But I think it's really crucial to understand that. And moreover, I looked at the children, native children who were born at Mission Santa Cruz between 1791 and 1831. And there's just under 500 total children that were born there. And when I looked at the infant mortality numbers of this, what I found was that over 50% of those children did not make it to the age of 1, were either stillborn or died in infancy. And then over 25% of those who had survived that didn't make it to age 5, which means that over 75% of the babies, children born at the mission, did not survive past childhood, 5 years old. And just to give a little context, because I did look at the archaeological records throughout the Bay Area of grave sites and cemeteries so that we can get a sense of what was the pre-contact infant mortality numbers. And this is all well documented in the book. But what I found is almost the inverse. It was about, when I looked at thousands of burials that we have records for, it was about 80% that were surviving into adulthood to the age of 16 or 17 as they correlated those. So the impact of the missions, again, is just a devastating one. But there's a lot more to this story than just loss. And I'm going to give you some of these stories. And in my book is filled with stories and examples of ways that people kind of persevered through this. In 1812, the main padre at Mission Santa Cruz was a young man named Padre Andres Quintana. And he was known for being sadistic and for his harsh beatings. In fact, he had just fashioned a whip in 1812 that had been fitted with wire or iron tips so that it would cut deeper when he was punishing people. In the fall of 1812, after Quintana had beat 2 young men nearly to death, a group of around 20 men and women gathered together to discuss what to do about this sadistic padre. And they ultimately decided that they needed to assassinate this brutal priest. We know about the details of this event from the oral histories of a fellow named Lorenzo Asisada. He was born at Mission Santa Cruz. His father had been one of the conspirators involved with this. So he was able to share his version of this, the oral history of this, when he was interviewed in the 1870s by one of Bancroft's historians. I worked a lot with this oral history, and I traced out the stories of all the individuals that he mentions or discuss or refer to in this account. And this led me to a much deeper understanding of the events of the assassination, and that's some of the detail that I'll share with you. So this close examination revealed that there was a woman at the center of this story named Yakenensat. She was baptized and renamed as Fausta, and that was the common practice at the missions. They were baptized and given Spanish names. And Yakenensat played a really key role in this story. Now, I should note that Asesara never mentions her by name. He only referred to her as the wife of Julian. And so I had to kind of trace out and figure out who was this woman. And as I did, I found a lot of details that really made me realize what an important figure she was. She was likely a leader in her community, the Sumu people. You can see here the area of the Tumoy and Sumu, which is over by Pacheco Pass area. And she was probably a spiritual leader within the tribe. Now I'll give you a little bit of details about Yakenensat because their story is fascinating. But she was born at she arrived at Mission Santa Cruz in 1807 with a group of the 50 other Sumu members. She was married to a fellow named Laka, or baptized as Julian, who had been an alcalde, so he was a leader within the mission community already. When she arrived, she was listed prominently, and the listings of the individuals often reflected social standing. Women were typically listed later, and yet Yakenensat was listed right after the chief and his family. So it shows that she had particular standing. And in the records, in one particular record, there's a note there that she was a monja, which is only two women who are noted as this. A monja translates into the Spanish to mean nun. Which of course she wasn't a Catholic nun coming in here, but it clearly kind of denoted some kind of standing there. Now in the story that Asesara gives, he credits Yakenensat with some really key parts of this. First of all, he credits her with developing the plan to kill Quintana. So she's the one who comes up with the strategy to do it. And the strategy basically involved calling she was supposed to call the priest, Padre Quintana, to administer last rites to her husband who had been sick. And so when he was to come administer last rites, a group of young men were supposed to attack and basically kill the priest and do this. So what happened on the night of this is that Yakenensat did summon Padre Quintana to the side of her husband. I should note he was the gardener too, and so they lived kind of in the middle of the plaza there, or in the middle of the mission area. And so when he was exposed, the group did not attack him the first time, and so she had to go summon him again to administer last rites. And they again did not carry through on this. So according to the oral history that Asesara gives, he says that she actually threatened the men and said, hey, if you do not carry through on this last time, I'm going to reveal what happened, and then he's going to find out what's going on. So that last time they do actually carry through in this. But as you can see, she plays this really crucial role of coming up with a plan, and she's at the center of this whole story. But to really understand, and this is where the example I'm going to give you of the way that these tactics and stuff have been communicated across communities, I want to take you back to before this, right? So we'll come back to the assassination of Quintana because there's a lot more to talk about there. But I want to take you back a couple of years to 1805 over at Mission San Jose, which is over the hill a little ways away. At Mission San Jose was a padre named Padre Pedro de la Cueva, and Cueva had a similar reputation to Quintana, right? He had a reputation, this guy, for drinking and for violence in multiple ways, right? Different accounts. And at one point, he was basically asked to perform last rites on a baptized villager who was living over in a village. And he was supposed to go administer the rites because this guy was dying. He was brought there by a group of scouts to this village, and it turns out he was brought to the wrong village, right? And they speculated afterwards whether that was done on purpose, part of an ambush, or something else. But in any case, his group was ambushed. There was a Spanish soldier who was killed, who was actually the first Spanish soldier who was killed by native people in the Bay Area. De la Cueva himself was shot with an arrow in the eye. He did survive it though, and he was pretty quickly after that, sent back down to Mexico, where stories continued to come out where he would be threatening his other padres with knives and with violence and getting drunk too. So that continued. But the important part about this I want to emphasize is that notice that the strategy was the same thing, right? They were calling him out to administer last rites. Now, where this took place was in 1805. And remember again that Ikenetsa arrived in 1807. So she would have been living in her village back in the Sumo territory. But this situation took place about maybe 50 miles north of that. So there's no doubt to me that she would have heard about this. The story of this attack and how they had done that would have reverberated around. People would have learned about it. But I think that there's another element to this too that's worth digging into, and that's about the issue of last rites and funereal practices. And I think if we delve into that, we can understand a little bit more here. So for Bay Area Indigenous people, funereal ceremonies were rituals of social cohesion, right? They brought people together, as funerals, right, often do for pretty much any society, right? But in Indigenous society of the Bay Area, tribes and families were often affiliated with a particular animal helper, right? They would be Bear Clan or Deer Clan, right? Different, have different affinities. Now, anthropologists refer to these as moieties. And basically, when it came to funerals, what would happen is members of a different moiety would help take care of the funeral arrangements for the other group, right? It allowed a particular family and kinship network to be able to grieve, right? And to be able to, feel what they needed to feel, and the other people take care of this. But this, of course, builds interconnectivity, right? It builds community. It's a way of taking care of each other. Now, when the Catholics arrive with the missions, they imposed their particular practices, right? Catholics had a last rites. And so at the missions, they would insist that they would have to do this. So questions arise around this. Was this a strategy that was first developed as a protest to this imposition of Catholic funereal rites? Or was it due to them recognizing a way to get the Padres exposed, right? Did they realize that by asking them to do this, the Padres would not miss the opportunity to go, impose their last rites, and so that would be a way to get them unsuspecting, right? So we don't exactly know, but what we do know is that clearly Nineteenth-Century learned from what was going on and was able to import a strategy from kind of the Eastern Bay Area down into the mission situation here and use it to take care of this abusive priest. Now, coming back to the story in the assassination of Quintana, I want to dig into a couple more stories here. First of all, I want to point out that when I looked at who was involved and who was arrested for this, I found that almost everyone, the only exception was Yakenensa, but the rest of the people involved in this all came from the very local, close Awaswas speaking Ohlone tribes, which at the point, I have a little population figure here, but the Awaswas at that point formed the minority. They were under 20% of the overall population. And I found this interesting, and I was trying to figure out what was going on, what was the background, what were some of the stories there. So what happened to the people arrested? There were 9 men who were arrested. And I should note too that no women were arrested, including Yakenensa. So in some ways, her Spanish patriarchy maybe prevented them from recognizing that she could be involved, and she was able to kind of stay out of their gaze when they eventually did arrest the people for this. But moving from Yakenensa's story to look a little bit at another prominent figure in this whole story, I want to bring attention to a young man named Lino. And I talk a little bit more about his story too. But I want to point out that Lino was 18-year-old. He was the youngest, he was the oldest child that had been born at the mission at the time of the assassination. And as such, he held a particular prominent place. He was the personal page to Padre Quintana. Even the Spanish accounts say that when Quintana had beaten him quite a bit, right? So he's at the center of the story, and a lot of the oral history goes around him. His father is also one of the men arrested, is Ules or Andres Cañizares. His uncle was also arrested amongst these 9 men. And when I looked at the group here, it was basically an expanded kinship network. They were from multiple tribes, but they all had very close family ties and intermarriages to Lino and his family. So he was really at the center of this. So I want to talk a little bit about Lino, but in doing so, I want to talk a little bit about the title of the book, We Are Not Animals, which comes from this very oral history in this story. So I mentioned earlier that this oral history, the accounts of this assassination come from Lorenzo Asisara, whose father was involved with this. But the quote itself is actually attributed by Asisara to this young man, Lino. And this came from that meeting where they were trying to figure out what should they do about the padre. And Asisara kind of quotes, gives stories about what these people were saying, right? And so this is the quote here attributed to the 18-year-old young Lino, right? And he says, the first thing that we need to do is to keep the padre from having the desire to punish people in such a manner, for we are not animals. He tells us in his sermon that God does not command this type of punishment in his example or in his doctrine. Now, Lino, I should note, is the personal page. He knows the prayers, right? He knows his teachings very closely. So he says, tell me then, what are we to do with the padre? Run him off? We cannot do, nor can we take him before a judge, since we do not know who commands him to do what he does, right? He doesn't know a process of appeal above the church authorities. It'll be better than if we kill the padre without anyone knowing about it. So in this story, a couple things. Lino recognized that Quintana has overstepped his boundaries, has failed to follow his own teachings. There's a hypocrisy here. Lino also grasped that the mission system does not allow for them to take him before a judge. So they're only left with one alternative here, right? If they're going to stop him. But I think what I want to analyze here is that moment where he stops and he says, we are not animals. Because I think it's really, there's a lot of layers that we could unpack to this particular statement. What exactly is he meaning by this, right? And I think to understand that, we want to look really quickly at what do animals mean to indigenous peoples, and what did animals mean for Spanish society? So for indigenous peoples, their world was based on a relationship and interrelationship, and a lot of it had to do with the natural world and animals around them. There were spiritual connections with animals. Animals visited native peoples in their dreams to bring them messages, bring them power or knowledge. Animals were also in places. I put up this map. There's a lot of village sites that we know translate to mean places. Santa Cruz was Aulintoc, which means the suffix "toc" in these languages meant the place of. Santa Cruz is the place of the red abalone. Watsonville is a place called Tiuvta, which meant the place of the Tule elk. There was Ipitak, which is the place of the rattlesnake, or Orastak, which is the place of the bear. And so animals played a prominent role in just the world around them, right? Even the village sites. And then, as I mentioned before, there were family affiliations with certain animals, bear clan, deer clan, things like this, right? So animals had a very important relationship, right? It was a relationship of connection with this. So when he says, we are not animals, right? It kind of makes you wonder, well, what is he exactly meaning in this, right? It's a different way. So let's transition and think, what did animals mean for Spanish society? So when the Spanish arrived, they brought with them their own crops and agricultural products that they planted on existing fields of native grasses and resources, but they also brought livestock, right, which had a huge environmental impact. They brought with them pig, cattle, horses, mules, chicken, right? Farm animals that they brought up there. And of course, though they had their own relationships with these, the ways that the Spanish related to them were, actually, hold on this, was through bondage, right? Through control, right? Controlling the work that they were doing. They were beasts of burden in many ways. So the Spanish brought with them instruments to control the animals, yokes to put on the cattle, right? Goads to drive livestock in the direction that they wanted them to go, right? And I should also point out that it was the native people who were doing this. They were the drovers. They were the ones who were managing the livestock. So they were put in charge of them, right? So they would have had a very close realization of how animals were treated there, right? And of course, they would have seen similarities to the way that they were treated within this. Now, when it comes to the missions, there's a lot of debates. How can we understand these? Were they penal systems? Were they concentration camps? Or were they idyllic spaces, benign spaces of teachings? I argue in my book and elsewhere that the best way to understand what the missions were for Native people at the time is to recognize that Native people understood them and complained that they were being treated as livestock, that it was a dehumanizing process. So the Padres didn't see them as human, or at least They said they didn't. Of course, now they're focusing on spiritual conquest, which acknowledges their humanity. But in their actions, which is what the Native people would have been experiencing, they would have seen the comparisons, the stocks to hold them, right? The whips to punish them, kind of a same type of thing, right? This dehumanizing process that goes. And Native people were treated, according to the oral histories, much more along the lines of animal husbandry, right? There's stories in Asisada's account too, where he talks about when a couple weren't able to have children, the padre basically inspected their bodies and did all these things. It's really scarily reminiscent of the types of animal husbandry practices they had. There was a dehumanizing element to what was going on there. So when Lino says we're not animals, right, he's coming from a society where relationships and interrelationships between people and animals and the world around them, what is it that he's really meaning, right? He's referring to the beatings and the whippings. And these are not indigenous practices that his people had, right? But these are how the Spanish have taught them to treat these other animals that are coming into the area. So ultimately, when Lino asserts that we are not animals, it's a rejection of the treatment that they are experiencing at the missions, and a rejection of the dehumanizing treatment from people like Quintana and other padres. I still went a little bit quicker than I expected. I was trying to make sure I didn't go too long, but that's, Kevin, I come to the end of that, although I could certainly happy to go explain more.
I'm here. I was listening to every single word, taking some notes. You want to talk what's on your last slide? You want to just share?
Sure, happy to share. For those who are interested in the book, the Friends of Santa Cruz State Parks has very generously offered to sell it for wholesale, so 40% off of the kind of cover price. So there's a link there for people who want to check that out. And again, this comes from really just a part of one of my chapters, third chapter there. The other thing I'm linking here too is, as mentioned in the introduction, along with other work, I'm co-producing a podcast called Challenging Colonialism, where we interview Native California people today about all sorts of different issues. Every episode kind of shifts to different things. There's not a lot of me in it narrating other than the editing, but it's really an opportunity to hear from Native California people about all sorts of different interesting things. So I want to invite people to check that out. That's available on most podcast platforms that are out there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll take down that URL and I'll send it out to everybody who's here, and even the folks who weren't able to attend, so they have that discounted offer. I had the link. A couple people have messaged me for the link for the book, and I was about to send them to the University of Nebraska page, University of Nebraska Press page, but I won't. I'll send them here instead. And now everyone is your chance to hit the chat or the Q&A if you have any comments or questions that you want to pose to Martin about the book. I will say that thank you for this, and thank you for the story, which I wasn't sure you were going to tell the whole story about the title of the book and where it comes from and the quote. And I love that it also kind of led into the demonstrating the interconnectivity of the tribes and animals and wildlife, and how that all kind of was a different, whole different mindset, a whole different thing for the indigenous people versus the Spanish. So thanks for elaborating on that. I know there's much more in the book, and if people want to check it out, they can, they should. So thanks for that. I'll just say thanks and give people a chance to put some stuff. There's a queue and here's some stuff going into. Yes, contact information for you. I have your website that I can send people to, and I'll put that in the email that goes out tomorrow. If you want to tell people your website right now, they can take that.
Sure. Yeah, my website is my last name, Rizzo-Martinez, without the hyphen. And if people want to email me, you can also email me. The best way to reach me is mrizzo@ucsc.edu. The one I have through UCSC. Parks deletes emails after a couple months, so it's hard to keep track of things.
Great, and I can actually just get that real fast and post it in in the chat as well. Somebody put the link. There's your website for everyone who wants that as well. So we do have some, I'm going to read some of the Q&A questions or some of the comments. And the first one is from Rosemarie. Says, what is the Native American population in Santa Cruz County today? What does it look like down there today?
Well, it's complex these days, right? So in California has the largest population of Native Americans of any state, right? But part of that has to do with kind of a history getting back to the 50s of like relocation programs where Native people from all over the country often families were sent to places like Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, where these centers were. And so a lot of the Native communities that are in California, in Santa Cruz, in the Bay Area, actually trace back, right, maybe a couple generations more recently. So it's a little different from Native Californian populations. But to answer that question, unfortunately, the numbers at Mission Santa Cruz is one of the worst. And there were very few families that survived. There was less than 100 about 10 years after the close of the mission. And by 1900, there was just a handful of families. The Alma-Woodson do trace back to families, mostly at San Juan Bautista, but they do have some connections there. And I do think that there are families out there who are not as visible, but there's very few who trace back to Mission Santa Cruz from the Awaswas Ohlone peoples. And so the population in Santa Cruz these days is very low. The Alma-Woodson people have ties there, but most of them, it's really expensive to live in Santa Cruz, and most of the Alma-Woodson folks live in other places a couple hours away, kind of far away from there. So, this is one of the issues around a lack of federal recognition for families and folks who survived the missions. It's also connected to lack of any kind of lands or reservation lands. There's a family that is close by who does have some lands at Indian Canyon, right? Anne Marie and Canyon Sayers, but most Native people from the larger region don't have access to lands and stuff, and so they're kind of spread all out. So yeah.
There's a great comment in the Q&A that I'm going to read for you. It's a little long, so bear with me, unless you want to pull it up, but I'll read it so everybody knows what we're talking about. Johanna says, it's a fantastic lecture, and you made so clear what the asymmetries of perception about animals was. Would you be willing to expand on the asymmetries of understanding of hierarchy and authority? The Indigenous people probably did not see authority hierarchy in the same way as the Spanish, as per your story, and the role of the woman who instigated the murder. Any thoughts on this? Anything you want to share about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important to know, and I think that the story of Yokuts a great example of this, but the way Spanish had a patriarchal system, right? Women had certain roles. Now, Indigenous peoples had, gender roles that, men did this work and women did this work, although there were exceptions and there were third gender and there was other people who varied in there. But as far as political and spiritual leadership, women were sometimes in those roles. So it was often men, but not always. And sometimes it would get handed down to a sister after a chief died or something like this. And there's examples of women who did have those powers. So I think that one of the things I argue in there is that that was a transition. That was a big change, right? To move into the mission systems. All of a sudden, women were not allowed the same avenues to power that they would have been allowed beforehand, right? So there was an imposition of kind of these gendered hierarchies as well. For Bay Area Native people, and there's some great works out there, that people have done on this over the years, but it wasn't as rigid in the hierarchies. There were chiefs, and there were people, who had kind of, political power, but they only had power in certain times, right? They weren't controlling people's lives. So the idea of hierarchy, it definitely was a much more family-oriented thing. Even tribes like in the area of Santa Cruz, it's like they would rotate villages seasonally. So they had like a system where they would kind of move around, and sometimes, the family networks would kind of move out into different areas. So it was a very different, way of being in so many levels.
There's also there's another great question in here, and I know a lot of people, I'm thinking this too, so I'm going to ask it. What different processes were there for the natives to be taken into the missions? Like when a mission was established, did it work like the later schools where usually the young people were pretty much just ushered in there, kidnapped, or were they offered services like food and healthcare and other things like that? How did that work, and how did they bring them in?
Yeah, that's a really big question, and I'll reference there's a great book written maybe 20 years ago now, by the late Randy Milliken, late great, but he addressed that question in a book called The Time of Little Choice, right? And what he argues, and he looks at the very early stages of this, right, when we know that the Spanish military was not a force to be reckoned with, right? They were very small compared to the villages and stuff, and he tried to address that, like, why did they go into them if the missions were so difficult? And what he found is a good argument is that it was a combination of factors. There was a curiosity to find out who were these people here and what were they bringing. So children were brought in first often. What they didn't realize is the Padre said, once you're baptized, you can't leave the mission. The children have to stay here because now we're responsible for instructing them. And so that created a relocation over geographically, right? And if you have a tribe that's got maybe 200 people or 170 people, and all of a sudden you have 30, 40 people who now have to live at the missions because their children are there, there's a impact to the society, right? It becomes difficult for those tribes to be able to maintain their practices and do everything. This impacts the trade relations, right? All of a sudden they're not able to trade the things and all this. So there's a social impact, but there's a political impact as chiefs start seeing, well, wait a minute, my members are going into the mission and that other chiefs in there, I'm going to lose any kind of political powers that I have. So that happens too. So it's a whole bunch of these. The ecologic impact is huge. I mentioned the impact from the livestock that are transforming these foods. So all of a sudden people can't get foods. At Mission Santa Cruz, when I analyzed what months people came in, it was the winter months. The majorities would come in. So starvation played a factor in it as well. So there's a whole bunch of them. But I should note that what I found, so Randy Milliken's work is great, but he stopped his study about 1800, 1805. And what I found is after that, as the local tribes had all been relocated, or most of them have been relocated into the missions, they started, the Spanish start looking out towards San Joaquin Valley to the Yokuts. And the stories that come around those reveal a much more violent process. At that point, the Spanish military is a force. And I should note there were some tribes that fought back. The Alsaima, there's certain tribes that led rebellions and fought back. So it wasn't uncontested, but there's a much more military engagement at that point. And the oral histories account for this, right? They talk about some of the violence that's involved with removing people, wholesale villages, right? There's a letter that I see with a padre who's celebrating. He says they're bringing back a whole village. They brought all of them, even the blind, even the sick. They brought everyone back here, and he's celebrating. He says, oh yes, rejoice. They've brought all these people back, but they're fugitives. They've run away, right? They don't want to be back there. There's a reason they ran away. Yeah.
So there's some other questions in here, but I have to ask the question about why were so many of the Padres just terrible people? Why were they, drunkards, right? Violent? Like how did that happen?
Well, it's really who we focus on, right? I think the story that's been around for the last 100 and something years has been of the benevolent Padres, right? That the Padres were the narrative that I often hear that people say is that the Padres are the ones helping, the soldiers were the ones, right? The Junipero story, right, is about that. And it really comes down to individuals, right? There were probably some who were probably trying to protect them from soldiers at some points. But what I found in my research when I look at Mission Santa Cruz is that it's not just Quintana, right? There's also Padre Obes, who does some terrible stuff, and Taboada, who's passing syphilis to the native women who are in the mission, right? And so, and then, the later guy, Jimeno, who comes over from Monterey, who's accused in some other accounts of raping a woman over in Monterey. So there are, I think it's a mixed bag, right? And these people are being sent up here. I mean, we want to think about the situation. The image I had of the Padres too, when I first started doing the research, I kind of imagined them to all be 75-year-old men who are kind of wandering around, and that's not the case. And then you think about it, it's like, oh, of course not. They're sending them up to the periphery of the Spanish frontier, up in California. They're coming from Spain or Mallorca or these islands, and they're coming over. They're training for a year at the Colegio de San Fernando in Mexico City, and then they're being sent up here. And they're usually 25-year-old men for the most part, 25, 30-year-old men. And all of a sudden they're put in charge of, at some missions, 1,000 people, right? Santa Cruz is a little smaller, 350 people, but all of a sudden they're by themselves. There isn't a lot of oversight. There's a Padre Presidente who comes and visits every once in a while to check in, but for the most part, they're kind of they're the people who are running this whole thing. So is it that surprising that, if you get a collection of 25-year-old men and put them in charge of, give them a lot of power over a lot of other people? I mean, some of them are going to take advantage of that power and do some awful things.
Let's talk a little bit about the research for the book. You mentioned a number of times about the oral histories. A couple of the Bancroft has certain things that you were. Tell us about your process and where you went and how this kind of all came together.
Sure. Yeah. I did a lot of research, a lot of places. I spent some months down in Mexico City. There's a huge archive, the National Archive, the AGN down there, which is really a fascinating place. It's built in the old prison from the 1890s, right? It's this really interesting kind of place with its own history. But I spent months there kind of going through all the records there. I spent a lot of time Santa Barbara, at the Santa Barbara Mission Archive Library, which is an amazing resource with so many documents. But that's, probably a big place where most of the letters through that whole kind of colonial period were. I spent some time up in Sacramento going through the state archives, and then a lot of time in Monterey at the Archdiocese with the wonderful Father Carl, who was just really great to work with. And I think the biggest thing really, and then I should say I spent a lot of time with the Harrington field notes. So J.P. Harrington was an ethnographer who in the early 1900s did a lot of interviews, and on this particular one I worked a lot with. He spent a good year interviewing Maria Ascension Solorzano, who was one of the Amamutsan ancestors. She passed away in 1930, the last fluent Mutsun speaker, and there's thousands and thousands of pages at the Smithsonian. A lot of it's digitized now, which is great. And I should give credit, I went through the baptismal records, and there's all sorts of wild stuff in there. I mean, you find certain names that are given where it's like the names are actually, it's a certain, for example, I'll give one example, but there's one chief in there who kind of ends up gaining control over some of the other native people, and his name is there. It matches the name of Coyote in their language, right? And Coyote, of course, the trickster. And so there's these layers where you could read into this and say, well, who's informing that? Is that really what he said, or is that what the other said? No, he's Coyote. Put him down as Coyote. So you can see these layers of information that's in these documents. But those registries from the baptisms have been digitized by Steve Hackle and the folks at Huntington. And there's an online database where you can get all these records, which wasn't always the case. 30, 40 years ago, you had Randy Milliken and John Johnson, these two kind of, prominent researchers back in the day who went, to each place, they're writing all this stuff down. So because all that stuff is available, I was able to kind of synthesize it, put it into my own databases, and really start tracing out family ties and connections. Which is what allowed me to get such a close view of some of these folks and to kind of connect and figure out what their stories were.
It's incredible the level of detail and record keeping that is available that you've kind of put together to share some of these, stories and what happened.
Thank you.
There's a question about the image on the cover of the book. And you didn't really talk about that. Is there a story behind that illustration or that image that you want to share?
Yeah, that's an illustration of an actual photo. I have the photo in the book inside with the images in there, the figures. That is a fellow, his native name was Irachis, and he was baptized and given the name of Justiniano Rojas. And there's a later chapter, like I said, my whole book spans into about 1900, but the chapter in the American era in the 1850s and 60s talks a lot about him and his story. This image was actually, so there's a couple photos, two photos taken of him in the 1870s. He died in 1874, so shortly before he died. And there's a whole romanticized story that came out around this same person. They mistakenly looked up his to see how old he was, and they saw a similar name from somebody much earlier, and they said, "Oh, he's 122 years old." And so this whole myth of kind of these ancient Indians starts getting propagated, not just there, but every city in pretty much in California has this certain old Gabriel, right, 120-year-old, 130-year-old, and this idea, and it was partly used to kind of boost tourism in California, right? It became like, come to California. The Indians live to be 120 years old, right? The water is so clean out here, type of thing. But his image, actually, a portrait is made and sent to the Vatican, and then another portrait is put on display at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, right? The big famous one. And so, and stories of him are sent in newspapers in Australia and everything. So there's this whole kind of awareness, and it's all after he's died. He doesn't know anything about this, right? But this kind of mythologizing of him. But I trace out what his real story was. Who was he really? I was able to figure it out and figure out that his real story is actually much more interesting than the fantastical one that they came up with.
Yeah. So your book and your research goes up to like 1900, right? Mostly. What happened? What's the state of the indigenous peoples now? How are they treated by the government and in communities, and there's a specific question about what languages are still being, spoken, if any, for all of these tribes.
Yeah, well, I work very closely, I'm the tribal liaison for Santa Cruz County State Park. So I work very closely with tribal partners here. Probably the closest I work with is the Amamutsan tribal band. And, they're working really hard right now to relearn the Mutsun language. I mentioned Solar Sano, and she was the last fluent speaker. We have, fortunately, she left so much of the language. And so they're actually working right now. I think they have a plan, I don't remember exactly, but to kind of bring back the Mutsun language into their kind of tribal meetings, over the next little bit of time. So they're all trying to relearn it. And they are just working hard to steward land. So we work as parks, state parks right now. We have MOU working with the Amamutsan Land Trust to manage some of the lands just north of Santa Cruz here. And I know that's happening across California to certain degrees, right? Where we're starting to, realize and recognize and appreciate just the level of sophistication of indigenous land management practices, right? We've had these terrible wildfires, and we've prohibited controlled burns for the last 200 years. So now we're starting to get to a point where we're and we need to do more of this, right? But learn to manage the lands in a way. You have to realize that people who lived on these lands and developed over thousands of years, right, the right way to live and kind of make the most of the environment. And we come in here the last 200 years and look at the devastation of what's happened ecologically, right, to the environment. So there's ways right now. I think that luckily, there's a lot of people interested, obviously, attending this and other talks. I think that there's a big interest right now, which I think is great. I think there's still a long way to go for a lot of different things. I know, there's some projects trying to bring back some of the indigenous names. I'm working with some tribal members right now. There's Fremont Peak, and Fremont has a terrible legacy of massacring thousands of Native people over time. And Fremont Peak was called Toyotak, which means the place of the bumblebee. Which is a much nicer name. And so there's a movement to try to see, can we bring back some of these native names? Can we bring back that awareness, right, of the environment and of that history and of the native people who are here? Yeah.
There's that. I live in Alameda, and one of our local parks was just renamed as well for the same reason. Like Jackson Park no longer exists, right? It's Chochenyo Park now, which is great. Well, that just reminds me to ask a question, because we don't do it often here at the book club, but you did it at the start of the talk. Is you did a land acknowledgement, which I love when that happens, because it really reminds us all of how important this whole thing is. What are your thoughts on land acknowledgements, and are they helpful? Is it making a difference? What do you think about that?
Yeah. That's a good question. And we're dealing with a lot with them at state parks. We actually are on a statewide level, right? The Tribal Affairs Office, which we have some really wonderful, particularly Native Californian folks who are working in the tribal affairs, who are just doing great stuff, like Sabine and Maya. But we are kind of looking at that. We're trying to, bring land acknowledgements into parks. And I think it's really important. I think, I grew up in LA, I grew up in San Fernando Valley, and I learned nothing about Native history growing up at all. And I, My mom still lives in like Topanga, and it's named after a native village site. And I didn't know that until much later. And now I have friends who are Tataviam from the tribe where I grew up, but I had no awareness of that. And I think things like land acknowledgements are great in that sense. It reminds people that there is a history here that goes far beyond the missions, and goes beyond that, right? There are people here. I think it's most important to know that there are still people here today, right, who are fighting for their rights. And I think that's crucial. There's a critique of land acknowledgements that they could be performative, right? It could be kind of a thing to check, a box to check and just do it. And that's a fair critique too. I think it's people say, well, we need to go beyond that, right? And I'm all in favor. I think that I think history, obviously I love history, I'm a historian. Like I think it's really important, but I think we live in places, it's so nice to know and understand like the deeper levels of that history, and so much of it has been unfortunately hidden, right? I think there's an erasure of Indigenous history in California that's profound, right? I mean, I think all of us who've grown up in California, maybe with some few exceptions of people recently, but most of us have really learned very little, right? We've kind of lost out on the opportunity to better understand the place we are and the people around us and these histories. So I think they're great. I think that people should include those.
Yeah, I think sounds cheesy, but it starts with awareness, right? If you're not aware of the land that you're sitting on and how it became the land you were sitting on and who was here before you, it's hard to do, as what Barbara says in the chat, like, how can you suggest how we begin to live in these places that were not ours, that were taken from others, kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think I'll go back to the thing I was starting with, but I think the most important thing people can do is learn. When I teach, right, and have a class, I'll have my students do assignments where I'll say, like, do some research, like whose lands do you grow up on? Like when you think of your home, like whose lands are those, right? What is the history of those lands? Where are those people today, most crucially, right? Are they able to live on those lands, or like in Santa Cruz, have most of them not have been priced out of there, right? They can't. And so I think that once you kind of do that research and find out and seek out that, then I think most importantly, like, what is going on for the tribes whose lands you're living on, and how can you help them, right? How can you see what's important to them? And what are the work that they're doing that you can assist in, right? Is there ways to contribute in some way, whether it's getting information out or going to their talks and kind of listening to the issues that are important to them? But I think, we throw around these ideas that decolonize things, and I think these are all great things, but I think it really starts with recognizing, acknowledging the people who are here today, and trying to seek out what is important to them, right? What are some of the things that you can do to get involved in this area? I'll bring it back. There's a sacred site in Gilroy that's called Eurostock, and it's a place where for thousands of years spiritual leaders came together from different tribes and had the Kuksui ceremony, which is this really crucial kind of pan-tribal ceremony that brought people together. And right now it's being under threat to be turned into a gravel and sand pit, which we have no shortage of. We have thousands of those all over. And so that's a movement that the Amamutsin are fighting for, is to try to protect it. There's a petition out there, and they're asking people to write letters to Gilroy. If you go to protecteurostock.org, you can see there, I think they just extended the deadline for feedback on the environmental impact report. So that's one thing you can do, depending on where you live. I'm sure that there's many situations like that all up and down the state.
Yeah, there's a perfect timing, because Naomi just put it in the chat that your land acknowledgement at the beginning was one of the best that they've heard, in terms of naming the local pre-mission group in the village and the larger language group. And then, of course, referencing those books. I think that was great too, to just kind of give people more information of where they can go to find out more. We're at the top of the hour, but there are a couple of questions I did want to get to. And one was your thoughts on, you at the top of the program, you talked about firsthand lived experience of these folks, and that's important to get. And so where can someone like me or one of our participants go to get more of those firsthand lived experience stories, to get immersed in what's happening?
Yeah, this is going back to the question too of what somebody was asking, like, what is the climate like today? I think we're fortunate that there are a lot of Native Californian community members and scholars, especially young scholars. I mean, there's a ton of really brilliant young Native Californian scholars who are exploring all sorts of different topics and books that are coming out. So there are quite a few great books. I mentioned a couple of them there, but that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. I think there's a lot more stuff out there. So I think it's just a matter of kind of searching for it, checking out, different talks. And I think, I think that there's a lot going on, which I'm really happy to see. I think there's, fortunately more and more interest. I think, personally, like teaching classes, I think after Standing Rock, I think that shifted things. I think I think a lot of people came back from that and said, well, wait a minute, what's going on here? Which I think is great and really important. So I think, there's a lot of that. Yeah, I see somebody says, check out the tribe's websites. Absolutely. Like it's a digital age. Like, I'm sure if not every, I mean, pretty close to every tribe has their own websites. You can go to, it is the NAHC, Native American Heritage Commission, which is a governmental run organization, but they work with the tribes and they have pages for each of the tribes that links to their websites and has information there. So that's one way to do it, where you can kind of do a little internet research and kind of track down those things.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a lot out there. So just keep looking for it. I think you'll find
I
it.
wrote NAHC. Is that what you said?
Yeah, Native American Heritage Commission. Yeah.
Put that in the email that goes out tomorrow. There's also a great app. I don't know how accurate it actually is. Like, I think it's called Native Land, and you can type in your address and it will tell you, the indigenous peoples that were on that address or in that area, and then you can do further research from there. So Native Land, somebody turned me onto that, and whenever I travel now, I always pull up that app and I go, okay, where am I? And like, what was here before we all came in and did what we did here.
Yeah, no, that's a great app. Yeah, and I think they're always updating it, so it gets like new links to things. So yeah, that's a really good place to start too. Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the chat, and I'm going to send you all of this, Martin, and we can talk about this, and if there are answers, we want to get back to folks. But there is one last question, which we will get to, which is from our good friend Terry, and she would love to hear what your next book is about, if you're ready to share it.
Oh, okay. Well, and Terry's gonna hear pretty soon too, because I'm gonna be on a panel with her talking about my stuff. I'm actually working on a couple different book projects, but the one I'm co-running a couple things too. One of them is going to be about the Quito State tribe of the Año Nuevo area, and that history. But the book that I'm working on, most of my focus is on, is quite a bit different from this. I'm looking at the 1970s, and I'm looking at, in particular, there was a situation that happened in the Santa Cruz County in Watsonville, where there was an armed confrontation between some Native folks. There was a burial site that was being developed. And so this is the era of kind of, Red Power and American Indian movement activism. And in this particular story, I've been working with some of the people who were there and involved with this and kind of doing an oral history with them, but recording their story. It happened on a place called Lee Road, and there was, again, the SWAT team was brought in, and there was AIM members who were there. It kind of became this big moment. Fortunately, it didn't end with bloodshed, and they're able to find a way to protect the burial site, but it hasn't been talked a lot about. It was called, referred to by Native folks at the time as Wounded Lee, as kind of a nod to Wounded Knee, that it happened 2 years earlier. So I'm looking at that. I'm looking at, there's a couple other moments around the Bay where similar type grassroots activism by Native peoples to protect burial sites and sacred sites, and looking at that and looking at kind of how that shifted things, right? And kind of that was right at the time that helped kind of create the situation where now at archaeological sites, they bring in Native monitors, right? But that was kind of a result of this type of activism. So I'm looking at how that, and I'm trying to interview people, because I know a lot of those folks are getting up there, but some of them are still around. So I'm kind of focused on doing it as more of an oral history project.
Well, we'll have to have you back when you got that ready to go and talk to a book club audience about that. That sounds great. So it's about 10 after 6 now. We'll wrap up. And Martin, I'm just going to say thank you so much for being our speaker tonight. This was great. Lots of great comments, lots of positive feedback. I'll share that all with you after tonight. But thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, everyone. And yeah, I think I left my email and stuff. I'm happy. I like talking to people, answering questions. So, feel free to send questions, and happy to talk more. But yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And I'll put your contact information in the emails that go out tomorrow. So everybody will be all in your inbox shortly after that. And you can answer folks. So thanks everyone for attending this Book Club of California program tonight. Really great to have you all here. Our next program is a co-presentation with Litquake. Litquake is back in the month of October. So on Tuesday, October 11th, we will have a co-presentation with Litquake. And yes, it's Tuesday. Usually book club programs are on Monday, but for this Litquake program, it'll be on Tuesday, October 11th. The title for that program is Who Killed Jane Stanford? A Gilded Age Tale of Murder, Deceit, Spirits, and the Birth of a University. So Who Killed Jane Stanford? Tuesday, October 11th. And it will feature author Richard White in conversation with Julia Flynn Seiler. So again, Tuesday, October 11th, that's an in-person program here at the book club at 6 o'clock with Litquake. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link that's in your weekly programs emails that you're probably receiving from the book club. Thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. Thank you.